Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kiki Cleaverhausen, your favorite unlicensed historian. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Great Irish Potato Famine. I know some of you may be thinking there's no need to do an accent, but there is a need to do an accent. So I did it. Okay. The only background information you need to know on the famine, because everything else ties into it, is the fact that Ireland did not govern themselves during this time. And the famine took place between 1845 and 1850, and Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom. So they did not completely govern themselves by themselves. They were a part of it, but they weren't. It's complicated. I know you expected me to come on and correct her about the Irish and the British, but actually she's completely correct. It is extremely complicated. And then I'm gonna jump cut to my foundation being done, and we'll jump right into it. Let's put ourselves in Ireland in 1845. What is going on? Here's what's going on. The population is about, real quick, the reason why I'm not looking directly into the camera is because my mirror is set up to my right. I didn't set it up how I set up last time. We're trying new things. Okay, what were we saying? Ireland, 1845. Picture it. So it's Ireland, 1845. The population is sitting at about 8.5 million people, roughly. Now, when the famine ends, which is 1850, the population will be down to about 6.5 million people. That's right, they lost 1/4 of their population during this time. Now, it was lost with a combination of people actually starving to death wholeheartedly. That was cause of the death. And then you have people, most of them would wind up dying from disease exacerbated by the fact that they were malnourished. And immigration. So, fun times. Pretty much everyone was a farmer or farming of some kind. You had a select lucky few who were landlords and owned these huge vast estates, and then they would split up their property and rent it out to other families so they could farm their own land on. And then, of course, usually a lot of the estate agents or the estates would also have a larger farm that some of those people would work as well. And these farmers, by the way, which will come back as well, a lot of this I'm going to mention to you now, you're going to see it kind of rear its head throughout the story. Most of these farmers didn't have any rights. The landlords could just up and say one day, hey, I need you to get off my property. And they had to go. Like, there was no 30-day notice. It's like, oh, you were late with the rent one day? Nope, gotta go. You're SOL. So the Irish, most of them had no rights and were very poor. And they all heavily, and by all I mean pretty much the entire population, heavily depended on this little potato called the Irish lumper. And this little potato gave so much to the people of the Emerald Isle. It accounted for about 60% of their diet, 60% of the food that they grew. The average person would eat 8 to 10 pounds of these potatoes a day. 8 to 10 pounds. Keep in mind, they were doing actual back-breaking work, heavy physical labor, but like this little guy, the little potato, he's important. And unfortunately, he was supposed to be ravaged by a little fungus by the name of Phytophthora infectus. Yeah. She too had made her way onto the Emerald Isles, but she was actually in a lot of places. Ireland wound up being hit the hardest by it, but she wasn't the only person. She wasn't the only place that got hit. This fungus, they called the blight. It's 1845. They didn't fully understand what was going on, but that was the name that they gave it. The blight had taken a hold of their potato. And that's what I'm going to call it from here on out as well, because I'm done with the scientific name. So the blight actually it started in the US and had been in the US since about 1843. Scientists don't really know where it originated from, but they do know that it was caused by a bad batch of guano. Guano is bat poop, which they use as fertilizer. So they got a bad batch of fertilizer that made its way around the world. The blight also affected the rest of Europe, again, the US, Canada, I think Mexico as well, pretty much all of North America. But the factors that caused this to affect Ireland way more than it did anyone else was for a couple reasons. The first one which wasn't in their control, was the fact that they didn't grow a wide variety of crops, unfortunately. They had their reasons for doing this, don't get me wrong. Their reasons weren't like, well, that's stupid. No, they had their reasons for only growing limited amount of crops. First and foremost, the climate. Not everything grows very well in Ireland. It's protected from extreme cold, but it's very dreary and wet, and it doesn't get very hot there either. Not a ton of plants or a ton of crops are like, yes, let me be. Let me live my best life in Ireland. That wasn't happening. Ireland actually is very fertile, but unfortunately the majority of the population could only grow those potatoes because of the amount of land that they had and what they needed in order to survive. Secondly, it was easy to grow. Like I had mentioned before, most of the peoples of Ireland were farmers of some type, or I mean, even if they weren't directly farmers, they had to farm their own food. So at the end of their workday, they had to come home and take care of, food to feed their family. And this potato, you could kind of just plant it and forget about it. They're like, heck yeah, man, sounds good. It's nutritious, provides me everything that I need. For about 50 years, it had really worked for them. Oh, sorry, forgot. They also only unfortunately grew that one type of potato. A lot of the other places, they had a much wider variety of crops that they could choose from. In 1845, they had an unseasonably cool and damp year. It was a little bit colder and obviously a little bit damper than it usually is, so the fungus really thrived in that environment. I mean, once she reached those shores, she was just like, I'm here living my best life! And she did. Unfortunately, her version of living the best life was decimating a population. As you can tell by the title, a famine was caused by these potatoes. And I know there are some of you out there thinking, we know that they grew mostly potatoes. We get this, but why couldn't they get other food? Why couldn't they just, I don't know, eat bread or go fishing or hunting? Something. Why, how could this cause decimation for 5 years? Didn't they have other options? So let's take on the easier other options. These are the ones that the law didn't necessarily prevent them from doing. I'll get more into that. I know a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? Oh, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it. Now, if you're not very familiar, Ireland does sit off of the coast of the Atlantic. That's not a thing. Sits in the Atlantic. It's a little island, sits in the Atlantic. Right next door is England, Wales, and Scotland. The British Isles. So the Atlantic is to its west. The Atlantic is on its west. On the east is the Irish Sea. So let's talk about fishing. At least we're going to say deep sea fishing. Yeah, that's unfortunately not really a thing. It's 1845. It's dangerous. The sea is a very dangerous place to be, especially if you don't have a boat. Remember, these people are poor. Having access to a boat, not a thing. Having access to a boat in general that you could actually take out far enough to catch some deep sea fish, or just be far enough away from the coast to start fishing, still very dangerous. I mean, they were deciding, they're like, hey, I could either go out into the open sea or ocean, even though it's a few ways away and my boat will probably just tear apart because it's not made for this. But let's say that it didn't, I could still be eaten by the Kraken. I would choose to stay on land and starve than the possibility of being eaten by the Kraken. I'm just saying, just throwing that out there. Krakens aren't real. Oh, like Kraken! Sea monsters. They're real. Deep sea fishing, that's out. Now, let's say the interior water. The lakes, the rivers, the waterfalls. They wouldn't go chasing them like they used to. Let's take the fish off of that one. Which I should also, I'm going to bring back the other fishing, the sea fishing, in a second. You see, because the land was mostly divided amongst a select few who had these huge estates, you couldn't just fish or hunt anytime you wanted. If you did that, that would be called poaching and was illegal. That's right, it was the landlord's land. You had to have his permission, which he would not agree to, for you to just go and hunt or fish in a river, even if the river's public. If it ran through his land, that's then he then kind of owns that portion of the river to a certain extent. And again, back to the whole, it's 1845. Not everyone lived that close to the coast or had easy access to a river per se. Again, it's 1845. It's not like it is today at all. Remember that. Most people aren't even in horses and buggies. They're walking. They literally don't have time for that. There isn't enough time. Let's get back to why they couldn't just get any other vegetable or any other crop to grow. So first and foremost, when it became apparent in 1845, whenever they're like, oh, we're missing a lot of our crop, it was obviously a little too late in the season to just start planting other seeds. Like, oh, let's try this or let's increase that. They needed help now, right? The ship has sailed. But the laws put a very high tax on imported grains. Let me correct that. Not imported grains per se, but foreign grains. They put a very high tax on it so that way it wouldn't affect their economy. That's right. In order to protect the landlords and their estates, the British government placed a very high tax on foreign grains so that way it wouldn't affect the profits that these people would make. Luckily though, in 1845, the prime minister at this time, his name was Sir Robert Peel, he kind of realized once he kind of been officially convinced. But honestly, I'm not going to give this guy too much of a headache because whenever you hear the rest of the story, this guy's a saint compared to the rest of them. So Sir Robert Peel had secretly purchased, and by secretly I mean his political party did not know, or the parliament, I don't really know how he got around that, but I know he did. He wound up purchasing a lot of Indian corn. And by Indian corn, I mean it came from the US, so Indians as in our Native Americans. And he bought as much as he thought that they would need. It equaled about 1 pound per person is how much he wound up buying, which wouldn't be a lot, but he's just going on guesstimates. And the reason why I say guesstimates is because once they realized the crop had failed in 1845, the crop failures weren't evenly across the board. So on average, they lost about 1/4 to 1/3 of their crop. But some areas were hit way harder than others. Some lost less, some areas lost way more. So he's kind of like averaging here. So he buys this. And of course, he's like, okay, we cannot just give this to the people. Because of the laws and everything else he had to go to, he's like, if they hate me now, like the people aren't going to be happy that I did this to begin with. I really cannot just hand them this food. They believed in an economy of laissez-faire, and there was no social safety net at all. Well, there was a slight one called the workhouses. We're not going to get to the workhouses just yet, but they were terrible. So he came up with a plan to just go ahead and be able to distribute this. And also, the reason why he went with the Indian corn is because number one, super cheap. So yay for that. Number two, it didn't affect any of their grain laws that they already had in place. So, and because of that, he was like, okay, perfect. This gets around all the laws and it's cheap. Even better. But he made it happen. And good for you, Sir Robert Peel. Good for you. Out of all this, I don't know if you deserve a trophy, but better than what was coming. What they decided to do was set up relief committees. And what these relief committees would do, because at this time, crops had failed. And the prices of the food are skyrocketing. Because again, it's food, high demand for it. It's like you've got to have it almost every single day, multiple times a day. And there's not a lot of it to go around. People can't afford food. He set up a scientific commission, which isn't exactly helpful. Part of their job was to figure out what they can do with the rotten potatoes. Turns out, none of their suggestions were helpful. You couldn't eat it or you'd become violently ill. You also couldn't even feed it to the livestock. So I'm like, we'll just give it to the pigs. The pigs couldn't eat it. They would also get sick. And the few suggestions that came was like, it was random stuff like, dip it in bog water. That'll magically change the chemical makeup of this and turn it into a healthy potato. It didn't. That did not occur. You had other people who, they're like, okay, we know that the rotten potato tastes terrible and it makes you sick. But if you put about 15 different ingredients on top of it, you can't even taste it. And that's whenever the people were like, hey, guess what? If I could afford these 15 ingredients, I probably wouldn't even come to you about what I need to do with a rotten potato. And also, it still tastes nasty and I still get sick. The only thing they could do is just, well, throw it away. I mean, seriously, there wasn't really anything they could do with these sad little potatoes. So he's like, okay, here's the deal. We're going to set up these food depots so that way the people can still afford, or they can pay for the food, but they're only going to pay at cost. And it worked for a while, or they had to teach the people how to deal with it, because the corn, number one, which they would later call Peel's brimstone, this little mixture, it was mostly like corn and water and something, I don't know, it was weird. They would teach them how to fix it because they were just used to potatoes. You know, again, think about how many potato dishes we have. How many corn dishes do we have? Okay then, not many. That's subjective. So the Peel's brimstone, mostly because it was the yellow color that it had, it wasn't very easy to digest. So it kind of upset their stomach a bit. Not good, but not on the same level as the rotten potatoes. The corn just wasn't very hearty or filling like potatoes were. Again, 8 to 10 pounds of potatoes a day on average, and you're getting about a pound of corn a day on average. They did that. They were getting food. It was going okay. It wasn't going perfect, but it was going okay. Well, then the landlord started complaining about some stuff, and along with the British Parliament, they started complaining as well. So they started feeding them, but unfortunately the jobs were kind of starting to dry up because, again, they're losing a mass amount of crops. So there isn't a crop they can plant it, but they have to wait on it, but everything else is done. So there isn't anything going on. So they're like, okay, new plan. We're still going to continue to sell this at cost, but what we're going to do is we're going to give these people some jobs. Actually, correction. Some people still had jobs, but they're like, we're going to offer jobs because some people have now lost their jobs and they can't pay for the food. So the government is going to come up with a job for them. And that's whenever the relief committees started setting up shop, and they were in charge of basically making sure everyone had, or making sure that there were jobs that these people could do. A lot of it was road building. But unfortunately, they thought we were just going to be a couple hundred people. I mean, okay, they knew there would be more than a couple hundred, but, a few thousand people needing a job to do so they could afford food. Wound up being several thousand, like hundreds of thousands of people needing this. And they're like, oh, this is not good. So they had these people start building roads, and we're talking like anything that they thought needed fixing or had the potential of needing fixing was getting fixed during this time. You're talking about roads being built that led to nowhere. So that's what they did. Unfortunately, there were some bad apples who took advantage of this. Also, they changed the labor laws, I guess you could call them. I wouldn't call them that. Actually, I would. I would call them labor laws. So the people had to be paid per day instead of per job. So beforehand, you would get paid as soon as, you finish the job, which would wind up saving money. But then they changed it to where it's like, no, if that person is working on this day, you have to pay them for a day's wage. Oh, people were not happy about that. They're like, they are getting lazier, making the jobs last longer. Just not good for us. Not good for us with the monies. Because we're losing more of it. Because we're having to pay people a fair wage. Our outrage. And also at this time, the relief committees were kind of running out of funds. And the Parliament wasn't really willing to just give them any more. They're like, no, you're going to have to figure this out. We can't just give you more money. You're going to have to, it's loaned to them. Well, it was always loaned to them to begin with. You're going to have to get these landlords to help you out. Well, you see, the problem with this is the landlords also stopped having money. Not all of them. And some of them, I would always like to point out, there are always good apples as well as bad apples. So there were some good landlords out there who really did their best to help. There were some who were just honest and was like, I'm legitimately out of money here because my tenants can't pay rent. Therefore, I can't pay you money. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of a cycle here. And then you had other people who are like, I'm out of money, even though it's like, what is those giant stacks of cash behind you? That's like, That's pretend money. It's not real money. Nope. Definitely not hoarding it. Did it get out of my duty, helping my fellow countrymen? Nope. Not me. They were. Not all. I'm not gonna get too far into it because it gets very, like, boring, to be honest with you, about who owes what. The, like, fiscal side of it. FISCAL. Kind of the mid-1846. So Robert Peel was replaced as prime minister and was replaced by John Russell. And he did not like any of the stuff that Peel was doing for the Irish. She was like, this is not fair to the English and to the Scottish, who are also a part of this United Kingdom Union agreement. You know, they're being treated being treated better. I understand that, like, technically they've lost more, but, you know, not the point. Just being treated too nicely. So he closed down the relief shops. He was like, you know what? You need help, gonna go to the workhouses. These wondrous places, most people they were supposed to be originally, and they were, because I think they set up shop around the 1830s. They were only supposed to be for the most destitute and able-bodied. But even whenever people became so bad that they actually qualified to go into the workhouse, no one wanted to go. Because once you got there, you would be split up. So it was men over here, women over there, and by the way, your children are also kept separate from everyone as well. That's just the start of it. They had very strict rules. Some of them, honestly, it just makes sense, like no swearing, no drinking, that sort of stuff. You know, no laying about. Others of them, not so much, as in all meals must be eaten in silence. What? Why? And again, you're all separate. And everybody has to be working. Everybody. The women were in charge of knitting. I don't know what they would knit, but they were in charge. They had to knit. The men were in charge of breaking stones. That was their job. And then the children got some industrial training. That's right, everyone. It wasn't the parents who were getting industrialized training, it was the kids. That's right, train them to stick their little hands in between those machine cogs because someone's got to fix it. So most people, they just, you know, they didn't want to go to them. I don't blame them. This sounds like a terrible place. And they were. They pretty much shut things down. They set up soup kitchens, and it was also catching attention internationally of the Quakers. The Quakers even came to Ireland to try to help, and they got so frustrated and overwhelmed by the amount of people who needed help, they wound up having to bow out. They were like, we can't help you. This is way more than we're qualified to do. It was just a tragic mess. A lot of this came down to the British government not wanting to help. I mean, there were some vocal opponents of helping the Irish, I mean, to the point to where they were saying that the famine was God's punishment for them being whiny, ungrateful, and layabouts. Okay, and by the way, we're not talking about some random dude who's just like on a soapbox in Big Ben Square or whatever. No, we're talking about the treasurer of the British Parliament, of the British government, the treasurer. His name was Trevelyan. That was his last name. He doesn't deserve a first name. Okay. He was the one shouting this. There's a lot of proponents against them. But one of the things that the government definitely lacked was seeing how big of a toll this was actually taking on the Irish people. Keep in mind, they're estimating that in those 5 years, about 500,000 to 1.5 million people died. And the reason why the estimates are so, because I mean, that's a pretty big difference in estimates. And the reason why they have a hard time getting exact figures, even though the Irish did take census and things like that, is they noticed that whenever they would go to deliver the relief of food, they would sometimes hit a pretty rural area that they only thought maybe 300 people lived at, and turned out it was closer to like 1,000 people living there. So they had, 600 people unaccounted for that wasn't on the record. 700 unaccounted people. Luckily, we're not all dead because of this. They wound up immigrating out of Ireland. Most of them would wind up heading to the US. I mean, to the point to where there were landlords who were like, if you get off my land, I'll give you a ticket to America. And they're like, okay, bye. The reason why some of the landlords were actually offering tickets to other lands outside of Ireland is so that way it would lower their tax burden. Again, the after effect in the immigration levels would continue until about 1860 something. Some of them wound up going to British North America, aka Canada. Some of them couldn't get that far, so they just crossed the Irish Sea over into England. And then a few of them even went to Australia. But there are countless letters and just all these aid workers who would go out there to help. And anyone who actually saw, they would see how bad it was. There were people who, there's on record this police officer who was sent by a landlord to go arrest this woman for poaching and for stealing from him. You know, the police officer goes to the little cottage and was like, hey, I heard that you stole. You can't do that. Well, she would then proceed to explain that she only picked a couple of potatoes that were left over from the harvest. So, right, she was literally getting scraps. The scraps that they missed during the harvest, she was getting those. So she was like, I didn't think that that was stealing. And he's like, oh, well, where's your husband? Oh yeah, he died. What do you have cooking in the pot? She didn't say. He goes to open the pot. There was the family dog. That is correct. They were eating everything that they could. I mean, it was bad. I mean, imagine having to tell your children when they're like, where's Fido? And they're like, don't ask. Don't ask where Fido is. We're not going to talk about it. Let's just say he gave the ultimate sacrifice to be our best friend today. Fido is the real MVP. Those who would go to the workhouse, who would actually wind up going to the workhouse, some of them were so overcrowded and diseased because it got to the point to where they couldn't separate the sick from the healthy. The workhouses were overflowing. Cholera outbreaks, there was typhoid outbreaks. There were people listed who just died of fever. I'm not really going too much into details about how bad it was, only because it's a lot of the same thing. It was a lot of people making very hard, tough decisions to survive. Ireland can't save herself at this point, unfortunately. This isn't like you can pull yourself out by the bootstraps. Their bootstraps were gone. Like, they had no shoes. Like, this sort of thing, they just needed relief. They needed help from the rest of the United Kingdom, and they just did not give it to them. I'll give you an example. So, in 1846, the crop was also decimated by the blight again. Well, the 1847 crop, because they had a warmer year that year, wasn't decimated by the blight. But because they had so few seedling potatoes left, because they had no choice, they had to eat their seedlings, there wasn't enough crop to even support the population at that point. Now, in 1848, though, so the government could have just given them seedling potatoes so everyone could have some and they could continue growing it. They refused to do that. Hell bent on all of this relief work that they did, instead of giving them money, they wanted it to be loans. And instead, it just really made the impoverished people more impoverished, because those who were responsible for the loans, which were supposed to be the landlords, either easily wiggled their way out of them, or there was also, again, there were some who were like, I just can't afford to pay this, period. I don't have any more tenants. I don't have any more farmers. Give their, the land to like these larger farms. So again, only emphasizing more of the select few who would be able to survive this. We did just want to add on a technicality that all of the monies that were loaned to Ireland during the famine were eventually forgiven. However, it also must be noted, at the time that the loans were forgiven, they also increased their taxes and tariffs. Now, eventually, the blight did stop affecting the potatoes and they got the crop numbers back up. But again, the damage was done and it was major. And also the response was so bad, which this also led to a number of Irish uprisings of rebellion, aside from Robert Peel, who attempted to do some good. A lot of the response was very much just like, well, we'll just see what happens. Like, this is God's way of saying this, so I'm not gonna really interfere with anything, because we don't want to interfere with the economy, anyone else's money. Unfortunately, she didn't go into this detail, but another reason why many people find that the British Parliament's response to the famine was so egregious is because there actually was plenty of food being grown in Ireland at the time. But Due to the grain laws, a lot of that grain was being exported out of Ireland, and the government refused to change it so that way it could actually stay in the country and feed the people as needed. The response was so honestly egregious that in 1997, then Prime Minister Tony Blair officially apologized to the Irish and to the Irish people for how the British Parliament handled the famine. Modern farm practices have gotten much better, and thank God for fungicides can treat things like this now. I mean, modern agriculture, man, feeding billions of people a day. Thank you. I think people freak out about toilet paper. Wait till they're hungry. That's the story, the Great Irish Potato Famine. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe.